It's such a pleasure to have you with us. To start with, could you maybe tell us about what you do as an artist, futurist, and cultural producer?
Yeah, firstly, apologies for giving you such a wordy bio to read.
No, it's super interesting. There were so many things in there. I was like, ooh, so much to unpack.
It's like, I've got to take out all the large words. Yeah, so what do I do? Well, look, I guess I often describe myself as a transdisciplinary practitioner because I work across a number of practices in lots of different fields. So, as mentioned, I have a practice as an artist, as a future strategist, and as a cultural and creative producer. And I've worked across, continue to work across arts, design, and technology fields with that set of practices. Um, I guess I originally trained as originally started off as a new media artist and had a visual arts practice, and then spent a long time working as a cultural and creative producer. But I ended up doing a master's in strategic foresight and getting really deeply interested in the questions of arts and cultural futures. And through that study, ended up getting interested and curious and deeply concerned about much larger questions of our energy futures of work, which I sort of see as kind of nested conversations, as well as larger planetary and societal futures, really. So today, I guess I've been really in the last year or two, I've spent time bringing an arts practice, and in this case, it's much more, what I do these days is much more of a participatory arts and live arts practice that brings in many elements of futures thinking and future strategy. And a lot of what I do through my arts practice is actually trying to create spaces for public, or effectively like public interventions, so opportunities for publics, different groups, diverse groups, to have conversations about our shared futures. And more importantly, conversations around the kinds of futures we think we'd like to have, so our desired futures. So that's a little bit about what I do. Yeah.
That's brilliant. I'd love to know, so you trained as a visual artist. What was it that first piqued that interest in futures thinking? And then how did that interest lead into the more participatory, immersive practice?
Yeah, really interesting. It wasn't in any way planned. It was kind of quite a serendipitous journey, I guess. But I became really interested in futures practice when I was working really through my work with museums and arts and cultural organisations. I began to get really interested in the question of how arts and cultural organisations in history or think about their own futures and the futures of their platforms, practices, the ways in which they speak to audiences. So yeah, when I worked as a producer, I worked a lot with a range of different arts and cultural organisations, and some of them actually faced existential threats or perceived existential threats. So working with organisations such as symphony orchestras, who had really big questions around what their futures look like, particularly with ageing audiences. The question of future was always, and the idea of future being uncertain was always a background to a lot of the work I did, especially work as a producer, which involved looking at how emerging technologies could be used in more traditional arts and cultural contexts. But yeah, what really got me into this sort of larger thinking about the future as well was also having the opportunity to meet a couple of futurists and work alongside a couple of professional futurists. Of course, that was, and sort of seeing the amazing facilitatory and kind of conversation-based work they could do in all sorts of different organisations. So being able to have those organisations in cultural spaces was really important to me at the time, and still is, as part of my practice. But in the course of doing my master's, I increasingly became interested in these big questions and also existential questions around our futures of energy. And really the question of, how do we continue to power the very, very complex societies, complex worlds in which we live and operate in. You know, how will this be possible in the immediate to longer term future? And that, in combination with the equally, if not more complex questions around climate change and ecological change and mutation, is raised a number of questions. And I think my interest in returning to an arts practice, but this time a very participatory arts practice, was really about seeking other strategies to get people talking about these issues of immediate future concern in ways that I guess in ways that can be a bit more inclusive. You know, asking these questions of how can we have these conversations about our shared futures, our climatic futures, our ecological futures, our societal futures, with people rather than just with policymakers or just at the corporation or the organisational level. And there's something I think that's quite interesting about arts practice, in that you can, if you create art spaces can sometimes be, particularly in participatory or live arts, which could happen in public space as well. There's something nice around using an arts lens, in that you can sometimes create spaces for people to engage things in different ways, in maybe more playful ways, and engage really serious and sometimes otherwise really weighty, dense subjects, such as existential futures, in ways that might bring some lightness and some playfulness, and hopefully foster a deeper sense of engagement around them.
Yes, I love that as an approach, because you're so right. With a lot of these really big issues and thinking about our futures and thinking about climate change, I think it's really easy for people to get overwhelmed and emotionally exhausted. Whereas if you're approaching it in a playful, more community-driven, conversational way, it's pretty amazing how those issues can be unpacked, but also in a way that people feel more empowered.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's exciting.
Yeah, that participatory approach is just, I think really fantastic for that sort of, that collective kind of thinking or imagining what, like different kinds of futures. And I think that's fantastic. So Ana, do you mind telling us a little bit more about Paradoxical Objects and any other projects you're working on at the moment as well?
Yeah, so really excited to be able to speak with you today and sort of launch this project. But I'm going to be the artist in residence at MOD all through August.
Yay.
And very exciting. And the project that I'll be researching and developing while I'm with you online is called Paradoxical Objects, and we're describing it as a space-time agency for humans and things. The idea behind it is it's really meant to be an exercise in inviting people to look a little bit more deeply at their material world, their material everyday. So the things that we live with, that surround ourselves with. I think particularly as many of us are either in a lockdown or have come out of one, we've all probably been spending a bit more time at home. And Paradoxical Objects is an opportunity to look much more deeply at the material objects that we rely on in our everyday life. I'm going to be working with 3 really fantastic researchers. 2 researchers from UniSA, Dr. Tom Raimondo, who's a geologist and a geochemist, Associate Professor Claudine Sousse, who is a specialist in global supply chain logistics and sustainable supply chains, and a researcher as well from UTS in Sydney, Professor Chris Reedy, who runs the Institute for Sustainable Futures and has a specialisation in energy futures as well. So I'll be working with them to effectively look at ways in which we can map the origins and the journeys and the stories of some of the objects that are dearest or most relied upon by us in our everyday lives, and create basically ways to map these objects across space and time. Project's called Paradoxical Objects because it's really looking at the fact that there's many things in our everyday life that we can hold in the palm of our hand. I think the classic example that we always think of is a smartphone. They're often the first things that many of us go to reach for in the morning. They may be the last things we put down at night. We spend a lot of our day looking deeply into them, but we might not actually see them for what they are. And in one of the early chats I had with Tom Raimondo, he mentioned the fact that, you know, within an iPhone contains almost every single element on the periodic table of elements, which is quite astounding when you start to think about it. And when you think about the kind of minerals and the metals and all the human labour and the transport and the energy that is invested in something that we use every day and quite possibly take for granted, it really could either, I hope it really inspires a sense of gratitude for what we have around us, but also perhaps a sense of wonder for the wealth of material things that we have, and also our connections to these material worlds too.
Absolutely. I wonder if for some objects that might end up being quite confronting, to realise that this thing that you've been using every day or maybe bought quite cheaply has actually had this journey you weren't expecting. Are you, just quickly to pick up on the objects, are you encouraging for people to bring in objects that are sentimental or more functional? What kind of object would you like people to think about contributing?
Yeah, so the invitation at the moment is to submit an object that you can't live without or feel you can't live without. So that could be, the invitation there, I guess, could be for an object that has a practical purpose that you rely upon daily. It might be one that has, as you said, like sentimental value. And so you'd be devastated if you lost it or if you didn't have access to it. I'm really interested to learn more about the relationships that we have with our objects too. So there may be many other things that I can't think of that that people, in terms of our connections to our things. But I'm really open to the submission of different objects that effectively that we feel that we're very close to in some way, for whatever reason.
That really seems to, yeah, it's interesting what you were saying about how we've sort of been in isolation. A lot of us, some people are still in isolation or in lockdown scenarios, and yeah, just kind of kind of reviewing and looking deeper into things we might take for granted on a material level is really, I think that's a very timely project. And the fact that you're bringing in so many different dimensions of, different perspectives, like, different disciplines and ways of thinking about that is so fascinating. But from your perspective, what's been involved in this so far, and maybe also how has this changed moving online?
Yeah, great question. So originally this was going to be an in-person, in-situ residency. So I was originally going to be sitting in one of the studios on the gallery floor at Mod, waving to you all from outside one of the windows as you walk past. And the original idea was actually to invite people to come in with their physical objects. And we were either going to document them in some way or look at moulding and casting them. And so originally the tactility of being able to pick up and hold objects and cast them in certain ways was a really big part of the concept. So there's been a lot of rethinking of this for a virtual residency, an online or a digital residency. And the way in which the participatory element is going to kind of manifest is not just through the invitation, but once we've got an open call for the next couple of weeks for objects to be submitted, and we'll be selecting a small range of objects, hopefully ones that tell really different stories, and then offering personalised planetary guided tours to trace the location, to trace both the spaces, the geographic spaces, as well as the more geologic timeframes in which these objects are kind of originated from. So with some of them, we may end up doing many trips around the globe. We'll see how we go. But it should be really interesting and a lot of fun, I hope. So
I love the way you've been talking about it, and we talk about it online too, of being a space-time travel agency for humans and things. I think that is just such an exciting concept, but also for whatever the object is, to guide the project and take it on a journey. So what do you think, because I guess it could go anywhere really, what do you think is going to be the most challenging part of bringing this idea into being?
I think definitely the challenge, I think, is what makes it interesting in some ways. I think probably the complexity of these stories. I think, you know, even just trying to initially look at mapping, you know, what it might be assumed to be a simpler object, like let's say maybe even looking at how a canned good comes into being, you're still looking at these really complex supply chains and complex forms of manufacture in different locations, and obviously that's without even getting into the raw materials of how a canned good and its contents come into being. So it's I think that will be part of the challenge. I guess, yeah, I'm just so curious to be able to get into it and be able to start looking at the mapping and the connections, and also I think how we tell these stories in ways that are not just engaging by showing their complexity, but can also be, can avoid being too overwhelming through the complexity. So how do we tell this story in an elegant way, or in a more, because I imagine there's going to be a lot of connections going on.
Absolutely. So when you present the object back to the person who's contributed it, that'll occur over Zoom. Will other people be able to watch, or will that be a private one-on-one experience?
It's a really good question. I think we were hoping probably that it could be available for others to watch, or perhaps if it's a privately guided thing, perhaps there will be a recording of it. We'll have to see at the moment. Like, kind of the joy of the residency is, you know, you've got a month to explore these ideas in depth, and also test out how they sort of manifest in a live in a live participatory way. Yeah, so that's the idea. There was a project I worked on last year that was around futures of work, and for that it was called Workplace, and basically the invitation to people was to come and join me for 20 minutes, and I did a conversation, and I interviewed them for a future job. So the kind of the whole frame was that people would apply for a job in the future, and the joy was that everyone got a job in the future. But what was created was a future of work contract that was more a list of your personal demands on a future work that you thought was equitable and fair, than being told what jobs you could do or wouldn't be available. But those were really interesting because they were hosted in a physical space, in a pop-up installation. But what was interesting was that I initially assumed that most people would want to speak privately with me, but it ended up being almost a performative thing where often audiences would come, and most of the interviewees were really happy to effectively be on show as we would have these conversations. So I think that's the interesting thing with participatory work. There's so many different levels of participation as well. And not everyone likes to be really active in their forms of participation. Some people prefer to observe, and some people prefer to be in there asking questions, doing things, interacting with you directly. So I'd imagine in some way we'll want to try and foster both those kinds of, or something on one of those levels of spectrum in terms of audience participation.
Absolutely. I think that's part of what draws me so much to participatory work. You know, I work in theatre, and I find more and more my practice sitting in that participatory immersive world. And I think part of it is these things you've picked up on, in that there are way more ways for people to contribute, and it's far more accessible than sometimes those cultural institutions feel. If you're in a community space or in a more of a conversational space, I think more people feel included. But it's also funny because I think people who maybe haven't seen a participatory work hear the word participation and go, oh my gosh, they imagine in those horrible comedy shows where someone gets pulled up on stage and has to do horrible things. Whereas this sounds like a really nice way for people who haven't experienced a participatory work before to start becoming involved. It sounds gentle and hopeful and very inclusive, which is awesome.
Yeah,
that's lovely. I really hope it is. Yeah.
And I think, like you're saying, you're given that you've got this residency period to kind of play with what you're doing, you have the kind of unique chance to maybe offer different degrees of intimacy with either a work for like a one-on-one kind of performance or exchange, or opening it up to a larger audience, which is really, I didn't think about how that could be done online, but that's really interesting.
And that's it too, like it's so guided by the objects. I'm so excited to see what people bring in, because even throughout this whole conversation, I've been thinking, what would I contribute? And every 5 minutes I think of a different thing. So it's cool having a concept that then could completely shift depending on what people consider important, because it's actually quite an intimate question in a lot of ways. But by the same token, someone might bring in a fork that they use every day. That's also really important.
Exactly. Yeah, that's great, and I think it's true, and it talks to different needs. Like I can assume that certain things I can't live without, because I'm a person who operates in the world in certain ways. But yeah, you're right. I think it's an intimate question, lots of different levels, because we all do have some different circumstances and different requirements and different needs too. So it'll be fascinating to see that.
Absolutely. And so Ana, I know that there's probably, and like we're saying, different people will take away very different things from this project. I think it's given that it's so intimate. But what do you kind of hope for people to take away from the work overall?
Yeah, great question. I would love, I think I would love for people to be able to, even if it just goes through the process of submitting an object, to be able to just spend even a moment looking more deeply at what they have around them. If the project can inspire any sense of gratitude, or even just a sense of wonder for how the things around us have come into being and how they've reached us, and even a sense of how our lives are supported by the lives and multiple systems, whether they're ecological or geologic systems or supply chain and transport systems. There are so many systems in place that we're a big part of. And I think there's something that's both it's both a place of real vulnerability, but a place of real beauty as well, to acknowledge that. So look, that's probably a very lofty aspiration there, but
hey, aim high. Why not?
But even for myself, even if I was to finish this month and be able to see the things around me in a new light, I'd be really satisfied, and I could only hope that could be something that others take away as well.
Definitely. And okay, we have an audience question that's just come through. So Ana, what do you think are some things to be mindful of, or important elements to consider when facilitating a participatory work or performance with an audience?
Good question, audience.
Yeah, this is a brilliant question. The first thing I think that comes to mind for me is probably just to be really clear actually around intentions and kind of desired outcomes. I think that really shapes probably the way in which an encounter or sort of participation is maybe facilitated. That's probably my first thing. Other than that, I can't think of any sort of hard and fast rules. I guess it depends on the nature and the type of the work. I think also thinking about those levels of participation too, there's there's definitely sort of saying many different ways in which we can participate, and we do all have different preferences, and those preferences change depending on our circumstances too. But yeah, I think keeping those two things in mind, definitely intention and outcome, and yeah,
absolutely,
how people might want to engage or not. Yeah.
Now, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our half hour. That went so quickly. So just quickly, I'm sure a lot of people have listened to this and gone, oh, that project sounds great. What should they do next?
So, definitely submit an object, but to do that, please head to the Paradoxical Objects page on the MOD website. All the information is there. And definitely, if you'd love to be involved, please do submit an object. It doesn't take very long. Oh, it actually takes as long as you want it to take, but I reckon the minimum is around 10 minutes. If you do have longer, I highly recommend that you spend a little bit of time in object contemplation. But if you're short for time, you can simply take a photo of your object, submit it, and fill out the form, and we'd love to receive it. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing what comes through.
It sounds great, and like you said, great. We chatted about before, great timing with lockdown. I know that I've been spending a lot more time in my house than normal, and I'm noticing things I haven't noticed for a while. So this could be a nice way of people getting to do that in a more mindful way, perhaps.
And especially when we don't have the ability to travel in the ways in which you might have done. If you were planning a trip somewhere, interstate, overseas,
it's a chance. Could end up anywhere.
There's the option for space-time travel with your things. So that's hopefully what we can facilitate.
Perfect.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I know we've really appreciated you having, taking the time to have a chat with us today. It's been really, really great, and we're looking forward to, speak for both of us. But I think, we're really looking forward to the project.
Thanks
Absolutely.
so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ana and Ashton. Been great speaking with you. Yeah, and
you too.
Great involved. Take care. Thank you.